We have hit the top of the hour. We'll give people a few more minutes to join. Hopefully there will be a crush of new people joining in the next few minutes, or this will be a very small and short meeting.
A small and short meeting, that sounds great.
And while we're giving it 1 or 2 more minutes for people to join, I'd like to ask if there's someone here that is willing to take notes. Gene, don't rush to volunteer. I'd really like to see if we can get somebody else to do this once. And a huge clamor of voices coming to the microphone to volunteer.
I can watch the jabber, but we really need somebody to take notes in the Code EMD.
Brian, is there any chance I can twist your arm to capture the highlights? We don't need a transcript.
I will go into CodeMD and do my best. My problem is that I've been in 2 conferences, one on East Coast time and one on Bangkok time, and so I'm not quite awake. But I will do my best. I will be there, and I'll in CodeMD and type some notes.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay, let's go ahead and get started, I think.
All right. Welcome to the STAR Working Group session at IETF 109. It's one of the later sessions. Hopefully you've seen the note well before, but if this is the first session that you've attended this week, please make sure you're familiar with what is on this slide. It is important for you to understand everything that's on it before you speak up or say anything in the jabber ring. Our agenda today is to go through the working group drafts that we have in flight, and as time allows, and I expect time will allow, to talk about a couple of new drafts that John is asking us to take a look at. We're going to start with the status of the drafts that we have past PubRec. Does anybody have anything else that they think we need to be talking about during today's session? All right, we will jump.
Can you hear me? Sorry,
Yes, Chris.
I don't know if you saw, I sent a note to the list. If there's time, there was a quick draft I put, hopefully people got it. It's error related to errors with multiple identity headers. So if there's time, it would just be 2 minutes to talk about.
Yeah, to introduce it. Yeah, no slides, right?
No.
Okay, so here's what's going on with the drafts that we have in progress. John, do you want me to take it? Do you want to talk to it? Yes,
Yeah,
go ahead.
Do we have a slide for this though, or did you not put the slide in? I don't remember.
Oh my freaking.
But
Yes.
I can just speak to it. It's not important enough to warrant a slide. But if there's a slide, we can have it up. So I mean, the long and the short of it is, as most of you are aware, OOB and div, they seem like a distant memory. These are things that we did, like, you know, in the dark ages, long, long ago. Speaking of dark ages, I should probably turn my lights on. Alexa, turn the office lights to white. But those drafts actually are with the ISG, and both are past the ISG at this point. I think I agreed to allow div to block until OOB has an RFC number, because div does refer to OOB. And so really it's just waiting on OOB, which is waiting on one last bit of administrivia, so that should be done extremely quickly. Yes, that's a slide. Delegation, however, does have some outstanding issues. This is still an ISG review, and Ben sent quite a laundry list of comments on it, which are good comments, actually. There are really only two of them, I think, that I would bring to the attention of the working group in case people here would like to discuss them a bit. One of them is, we kind of floated this notion in the delegation draft that you could sign a passport with your CA cert. In other words, we get an intermediate cert for the purpose of doing delegation. We floated, hey, you know, there's really no reason you should have to make an EE cert to sign a passport. Ben flagged that and was like, are you sure you really want to do that? And I mean, this is something that came about back in the day because people expressed some concerns, and the second bullet here relates to that as well, about having to manage a lot of keys at their authentication service, and like just having to manage a lot of keys in general. As a consequence of that, you know, I kind of looked at this, squinted at it a bit, and was like, I'd be willing to float that as a possibility, that you can just sign passports with a certificate that has a CA Boolean set to true. That means, of course, they would live where your authentication service lives. And like a lot of times when we think of a CA cert, we think of it in an Iron Mountain. I guess I look at these certs for delegation as being a bit less protected than those, in part because, much like with RPKI, right, they have this encompassing semantics. And so there's ways to kind of limit what you can issue certificates for. And kind of the worst thing you could do if you had like access to that is issue a certificate for some subset of the permissions that the entity that was granted this particular intermediate cert has. And so, you know, I'm kind of on the fence about this because it's something I floated. I don't know if anybody's actually going to use it. Like in the discussions we're having about delegation and like, you know, Addis and the Shaken ecosystem, for example, it's not clear that people are like jumping at this chance. It's really something, like I said, we floated because people just wanted to have less keys. Does anybody feel strongly about this either way? Russ, do you think this is terrible and we should like stop and not do it?
Well, now that we have a little more experience with how Stir Shaken at least is being rolled out, there are certain CA keys that I think it would be bad to sign with at the top of the chain. But as delegation was intended, it's lower in the chain, I don't see a problem.
Yeah.
So maybe we say something like that in the security considerations.
Yeah, and I mean, kind of my intuition, I mean, Ben suggested some language that I think improves it a bit and kind of talks about more about the option of putting, you know, generating an E cert off of that intermediate cert, which is fine with me. I think we go with that and be okay. And is there anybody else on that? Chris?
This is Chris. Probably the hour, but so don't we create delegation certs, delegated certs from intermediate certs already? I'm missing. I'm probably missing the point.
So the point of this is like that intermediate cert you're having that you use to create delegate certs. Like I'm suggesting, or the draft currently says, you can sign passports with that cert. And the alternative to that, like the more secure option than that, would be to say, no, the only thing you can sign with that intermediate cert is delegate certs. Don't sign passports with that. You have to make another instrument with permissions identical to the permissions of your intermediate cert and use that EE cert you made from it to sign your passports.
Got it. Yep.
And like, again, we introduced this just because people, I mean, you know, I'm thinking Martin, among others, back in the day, like was like, we can't have too many certs. Like, I don't want to have this key ring or whatever. And so like, this is one of the things that pushed us to say consolidated. I just don't see the danger as being as severe because the permissions are already constrained in terms of what kinds of certs and what scope of authority those certs will have that an intermediate cert can issue. So nobody's yelping. I think I'll probably push back to Ben and say we'll keep it, and we will put in some language, some better language about the alternative which he proposed. The second issue here is about cross-certification, about aggregating permissions from multiple certs. Same justification, precisely the same. If you're an enterprise and you're getting, you know, 15 delegate certs from the 15 carriers that you get telephone numbers from, wouldn't it be great if there was some way to consolidate those permissions? And Ben rightfully pointed out that, you know, we put some text in about, okay, you can use like the AIA to point to like, you know, how you're cross-certifying, but he's like, how does that interact with the like authority key identifier, subject key identifier ordering that you use for certificate path construction? And I did read that and was kind of like, yeah, that's true, actually. Like, we would have to define what that interaction is, because we kind of make it out like that AKID, SKID ordering is very deterministic, much more so than ordinary path construction you might perform to try to get back to a particular trust route. But once you start throwing cross-certification into that, even if you have a single route, even if you have like a shaken-like, you know, route, you're still potentially gonna run into some middle path construction issues that are weird. And so, you know, we could, it's tendered really in an exploratory way in the draft. It's kind of like, hey, if you wanted to do this, you could probably, you know, use AIA to do it. And I think it's probably okay to do it. There's no normative language surrounding any of this. This is in one of these paragraphs. It's like, if you felt like it, you could go down this path. So, I mean, I think we're probably okay to keep it if we want, but anybody having strong feelings about that we need to clarify this before we can proceed with the document?
It is kind of complicated and ugly. I think Penn was right to flag it. Do you really mean to do this? Because you're basically taking two different branches in the middle of your PKI and pulling them together at the leaf. And the cost to the signer is that they just have to pick the correct leaf if you don't allow this bowing. And that isn't an awful thing either. And it may actually force the signers to be a little more cleanly than they might otherwise be. So I'm not opposed to getting rid of it.
Again, it's the familiar argument. It's just I'm an enterprise. I don't want to have a key ring of 15 EE certs. And like, you know, maybe people just need to suck it up. I mean, you know, in reality, I think it's more realistic that people might have like 5, and a lot of people just have like 1 or 2. You know, I don't think there's that many entities that aren't effectively carriers. And of course, you know, the shaking ecosystem is transforming in terms of how it deals with some of these non-carrier entities at this point. That's something that's like changing this week. So, I mean, you know, I think I'm okay telling them to suck it out if we want to take that out.
Yeah, I think that what Ben put in chat, Ben Campbell put in chat is right, that there's a lot of complexity there, yet the return is pretty small.
Yeah, this is Chris. I really don't see chains that long. I mean, I don't think we really anticipate that complex scenarios, do you? or at least
I mean,
not.
this is just 15 chains that are all one leg long. That's the problem. It's that, I get my, I'm an enterprise and I get numbers from AT&T and Verizon, and Comcast, and I don't want to have 3 certs.
Yeah, I think we're trying to solve those more complex issues with vetting and other
Agreed.
concepts. Aggregate these things more simplistically.
Go ahead, Ben. I think we might be small enough a group that we might not need to do the raise hand thing. Let's see. We'll institute it if it becomes problematic. But go ahead, Ben.
So my incoming sound went weird when I clicked the mic button. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yep.
I was going to say, this sounds like one of those things that if it becomes a problem and people want it, we write another draft on how to do it some other day and not talk about it now.
So I'll rip it out. Anybody mad about that? All right. So I think that's it. That's enough for me to go back to Ben with, and his discuss, I think, was the only one. There's a lot of other comments. There's a lot of he has a lot of good catches in there. It's nothing I think that we need to run in front of the group.
All right.
Video out.
So, sorry for the horrible dance to get this right slides shared, but I discovered, as I mentioned in Jabber, that this thing that looks like one window is not one window. So Chris, just let me know when I'll advance, and then you just let me know when I
Sure.
should go further.
Ben, is that a new hand? Since it went away, I'll assume no. Go ahead.
Okay, RCD, I'm sort of combining this with the SIPCore stuff, which is, there's no meeting and all the relevant people are probably here anyways. So, we're sort of pretty much still at the point where it's mostly editorial updates coming in. Most of it related to clarification on the SIPCore call info stuff, since we made that a pretty tight dependency. So a couple of things that I included. One was clarification on how compact form works. Got a comment about we were only saying from as the source of the display name, added an alternative to use p-asserted identity. I assume people are okay with that. Let me know if anybody has heartburn with that, but that's generally what we've been doing anyways for most of the sources of the name. I don't hear anything, so that's good. This has been unfortunately a common problem. A lot of the examples, we always missed the array brackets and the desk claim, so and that caused some confusion in some of the implementers. So I fixed that. The other thing I clarified was for JCL, and I actually clarified it in both documents, that the my media type should be application JSON, pointing to 4627. It is also pointed to in the JCard spec as well, but I thought helpful to include it there as well. the specs, I think, pretty mature. I don't think like we are starting to get some implementations happening of it, and things are looking pretty good, I think. But maybe go to the next slide. And just so people know, we do have a corresponding spec in IPNNI that is also getting mature. Yeah, so for call info, one question that came up, and I wasn't sure how to handle this actually, was that if we only had name and call reason, but no J card, so in other words, no real URL, that could be pointed to, and call info. The first thing is the URL. Does that mean we really should be? We made call reason a parameter at the end, and should we really have made it that we have to use the same CID style link into the body for call reason also? So just curious if anyone has any opinion there. I'm sort of thinking, I'm not sure there's any way to avoid that, but curious if people have any thoughts there.
Well, we could always go back to subject. This is a slightly non-serious proposal, but I mean, having a header that contains the reason independently would be an alternative to having it be in the body.
Yeah.
And like subject header, which is not used for anything, is a place where call reason could live. There are a couple of reasons why we didn't do that, but
Yeah.
like defining new header is not out of the question. It seems like a hassle to have a body.
I know.
It's like an independent body just to contain a text string. Like it should be in a header.
Yeah, the question is where should we do that? In the same draft?
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah.
Probably.
Okay.
I mean, we have a lot of SIP expertise on this call. Like, SIP expertise people, like, how do you feel about subject? I know we've talked about subject here once or twice. Do you think it's worth clobbering subject?
I think that not that we know of any real uses of subject in the field. I think that the co-opting of it would likely run into it would close doors in other places with a weird side effect, and I don't think that's really what we want to do. So it may be 3:30 in the morning talking, but what about just jamming all this stuff into a data URI since you can already carry a URI in that header?
Data URIs are never my personal favorite, kind of a pet peeve of mine. But this might be the time has come for that. I mean, I think the only reason why I'm not just saying like, some kind of quoted string that we pack into the call info header should suffice, even if we don't parameterize it in some fashion, is that, I imagine we want to leave the door open to having more structured data types for reason, for internationalization purposes, is I think the argument we've mostly made. But like, I can imagine other kinds of structure as well that might make it look more like a body at the end of the day. More like, an XML document or JSON document that contains information that is separated out into segments for display purposes. And that's one of the things, just trying to create something that at least leave us the opportunity to do that. It's one of the reasons why I've looked at it as being kind of independent. I don't know.
Yeah, no, it's a strong enough argument for me.
Yeah,
I think I like it. I like it as its own header best, and if we can't use subject, I might just propose, you know, a reason header.
Yeah. I mean, it does seem like something that is potentially important, you know, in general. So, to me, seems like it has some justification, and for all the reasons you were saying, John, you know, just for a string, I totally agree on that perspective. Any other thoughts or? Okay, I'll start down that direction. Maybe I'll ask on the list just in case as well.
Better idea than us at 1:30 in the morning.
Yep.
Yeah, please raise it on the list. And I think you're saying the SIP-core list, right?
Yes. Yes. That's true. I wasn't thinking that, but you're right. Okay. Yeah. So I think might be worth having another round. Hopefully, you know. But we do want to sort of knock this out. People are hopping on this bandwagon pretty quickly. So, but like I do want to solve like some of these fundamental issues before we start talking about working group last call. So that's it for that.
Yep, sounds like a plan.
Yay. Talk a little bit about service provider OOB. I'm getting a little echo.
It's probably from me.
Okay. So we're not going to do a ton on this tonight, in part because there's a lot going on with it at the moment, and you know, it's a bit in flux, but we'll at least cover some of the basis of what's going on with it. So this is a document that is examining doing OOB from more constrained environment, places where you assume that CPS is not a third-party service, but instead something that is actually in the call path, and not that it already sees the called and calling party numbers. And it's either operating, you know, it's operated by the originating terminating domain or kind of on behalf of it. And there are gateway cases parallel to that we'll talk about a bit as well. But this is something that's becoming an increasing subject of interest because a lot of people are coming up against this wall that their TDM providers exist. People are trying to figure out how to accommodate them. And so this is a version that is trying to solve the fundamental problem of dealing with TDM without having to have a third-party service you treat as an adversary be the call placement service as we stipulated in the original out-of-band RFC. Next slide. So the way that the document is framed right now, it really does look primarily at the use case where the OB is operated by the terminating service provider. And it is the kind of obligation of authentication services or some entity in the network to push passports to this call placement service that is either composed with or adjacent to the verification service in the terminating service provider. And that's how we get the passports where they need to go. And because of that, we argue you don't actually need to encrypt passports. They could go directly from the originating to the terminating provider. I think, is this actually my current version of these slides? I think I may have sent the wrong one for this. because I did a new version of this deck, I know, for this, and this actually seems like the version that I built it from. So this may be less useful than I intended to be, but that version talked quite a bit more about gateways and about the gateway use cases that are being explored at the moment. And these are use cases where a gateway probably has a trust relationship with the same trust anchor that certifies the originating and terminating providers. And that stipulation is kind of what enables them to participate in the ecosystem as kind of equal players, provided again that these are the in fact gateways that see the signaling, see the actual calls set up. That's the crucial component of it. So that enables transit providers to participate as gateways. And there are a variety of mechanisms that are under consideration for how CPSs can discover one another. There's been a lot of conversation in ATIS recently about kind of having a federated CPS that uses some kind of like gossip protocol or something to share passports between CPSs that are all mutually participating to provide a service to the entire ecosystem as all enrolled and trusted entities that are kind of independently vetted and accountable. So next slide. This is a picture of all that. Next slide. Showing the CPS there composed with the terminating service provider. And what that interface actually looks like, it could be a push interface. There are query interfaces being explored for this as well. For the gateway case in particular, it's kind of crucial to have that query interface, because effectively the query is proof of possession on the part of the gateway that it's actually seeing the call going by, and that triggering it to ask for it is kind of part of the implicit trust model for getting them on board. But that obviates any concerns we have about people like polling the CPS as well, since these would be enrolled and trusted entities that are trackable. So basically this entire thing is an exercise in trying to find out how much of the security environment we put forward in the original OBRC you can relax, provided that these are kind of in a more closed environment. Next slide. This is entirely the wrong deck. I don't know how I ended up sending this. What I think I said in my previous one is there's more work that needs to be done to align with this. This is something that is literally changing like this week. I've been on a bunch of calls about this week. And so, I think there's, we're gonna have to wait another cycle before we're actually able to really kind of start talking about advancing the document beyond this, at least another cycle. That's what I want to say about this. I really wish I had presented the other slides. I'll make sure that they're actually uploaded in the minutes properly. But any questions about this, about direction? Anybody who hearing me talking about gateways is becoming terrified for some reason, or? Okay. Gateways have always been in the scope of use cases we're considering for this. That's not particularly novel. Chris?
Yeah, I was just going to ask, because I'm familiar with the other work going on. I assume you're planning to align with that, or?
I think what we're planning to do is to provide the kind of baseline IETF style security rationale that enables that, and not go a ton farther than that.
Right.
So,
Okay.
there are things about that approach that I don't think it would be appropriate for us to specify in the IETF, we'll put it that way. But I think we want to make sure that we're articulating why we think this is a plausible security environment, and kind of what some of the design choices are that you have when you go down some of these paths.
Makes sense.
So yeah, that's good for that. What's next? Am I next, or is Chris next? It's kind of a mystery. Soon we shall see. No, Chris is next.
I'm back.
If it didn't require punching so many buttons, I would have put a drum roll in there.
Yeah, I was going to say this is sort of fun. Okay, emergency services. Next slide. So there was a pretty major update, and I see Jack's in the meeting as well. So really appreciate his comments on the list. We did change, and I think changed for the better, how we instead of creating 2 more keys in the RPH claim, we're reusing auth now for the ESNet.x identifier that's associated with the call. And I have some examples below that show that. So, and the document I've updated pretty much for, I think, all the scenarios that would actually happen, but I think there was one more example maybe, but you sort of get the point there. Yes, the zip priority header stays the same for the PSAP callback, but and there might have been some other clarifications that I also included related to the use of PSAP callback. I think there were some questions on that too. Did I have another slide? I forget. No. Okay. Yeah, that was the major change. So I think we're already headed down the path in working group last call. So I don't think that needs to change. I assume, maybe I'll pause to get any comments if anybody has anything to say about that change. But I think I've pulled most of the people that care about this subject. So, okay. I think that's pretty much the update.
Yeah. So, is there any reason not to try to hand this to the ISG sometime December, January?
I think that would be good. I think, in IPNNI, there's work that's progressing that's getting pretty mature there too. So, yeah, I think it'd be
nothing that this thing needs to wait for. Even
no.
Yep. All right.
It's the other way around, actually. So, if we can get this through, I don't think there's anything. Hopefully, not anything controversial left. I think it's pretty straightforward. So,
Awesome. And we can start the drum roll again.
sounds good.
My draft through SIP-Core, but this draft is not dependent on that. It can reference the thing that's there. It doesn't reference what I have, so that's just motivation, and there'll be a SIP-Core mechanism thing because there's a change that this draft introduces. So there's no dependencies on this draft. Does not have a dependency on that draft.
Thank you.
All right. Now we're getting to the exciting stuff. So rather than just updates of things that we're talking about each time, this is one we haven't talked about in a while. I think we last talked about this actually at IETF 101. But there was a new version of it last time that we did not discuss. And there's another new version of it this time. This is connected identity, looking back at the great lamented John L. Wells original spin on how to get 4474 to play nice with mid-dialogue requests. Next slide. So yeah, this is an old one returning. Look at this. These are actually my slides for this. This is good. This is a new deck. This is not an old deck. This is not a rerun. I mean, the basic classic problem that 4916 explored was the problem of what happens when you connect to some unanticipated target of a SIP request, and it needs to use the identity header when it sends an update request in the backwards direction to affirm its identity, but that's not the identity you actually expected to see. And the way that dialog matching works in SIP, you're supposed to have the same from header field unless you have this new thing that he put in that's called a change from that allows the terminating side to be able to send back its own address of record in the from header field in something like an update request, which is pretty cool. And so we need something like that that's going to work with 4474 as well. It's just in general principle. It's probably a good idea for us to articulate what you do in that circumstance if we care at all about being able to have dialog matching work properly with STIR. But it also, and this is why we're bringing this back, there's a certain amount of interest in a set of security vulnerabilities that we think that this practically addresses. Route hijacking is one of them, and this is really, if you look at what that update in the backwards direction can convey, there are unfortunately a number of attacks that arise in mobile networks, and as well could arise in just kind of any IP network that doesn't use PSTN style TN routing, where you could end up with an attacker who somehow manages to respond to a dialogue that you started, and like the route hijacking of this and the mobile networks is probably the most famous case like it. So I mean, there's actually security vulnerability we think that you address with that alone. But then there's this whole class of attacks like short stopping. This is an attack that's in international mobile networks, especially where untrusted intermediate or transit networks kind of make one side of the call think that the call is terminated, but convince the other side that it's still ongoing in order to do a kind of toll fraud. And you do this for just like a couple seconds, but you do this for like a lot of calls. It adds up over time, and like people actually make money off this apparently. And this is the kind of thing that if they were doing it with STIR, they would have to be forging a buy or something like that in this case. And so we're interested in defining like how this works for those kinds of cases. And then there's this SIP Randy thing, which is yet another document like OB. Well, I guess OB is no longer, but like a number of things that are trapped in cluster 238 for some bizarre reason. So yeah, if anybody wanted to actually use SIP to negotiate end-to-end media security full stack, we'd need something like this to work as well. And the SIP Randy documents do note that. Now, the kicker is, of course, this does take STIR a bit past the threat model of 7374, of 7375, and also, the STIR problem statement, which articulates that we're here to beat things like, robocalling, which is really just about the initial invite that establishes a dialogue. And so we kind of have to be cognizant if we're taking this on. We are kind of changing the scope of what we're discussing. But I think it is a natural extension to the practices that are articulated in H24, that you be able to sign requests other than an invite with an identity header. It's going to happen, and we might as well kind of bite the bullet and figure out how to do it. So next slide. I mean, this just kind of shows a case where you're trying to call your financial institution, for example, and wouldn't it be great if you actually had some indication coming from, Bank of America that you've in fact reached Bank of America, and that there isn't some nefarious like intermediary that has instead routed your request to an attacker. And like that assurance is something I'll talk a bit about the experience of it in a bit. That's one of the main things we're trying to achieve with this, and really what the original 4916 provided for 4474, that it would be great if we could find a way to make it work for 8224. Next slide. So, I mean, a good question is like, how useful practically is this? An authorization decision that you make after a call has connected, after you've already gotten a 200 OK, is obviously of somewhat limited utility, and arguably even like an authorization decision you're making while the call is alerting. Like if you're holding, your phone to your head and, it's trying to show you something about who it is you've connected to, that's probably not terribly useful. But it is something that we could treat much the same way as we treat, a failure of negotiating SRTP, for example, where if the keying isn't successful, like, media just isn't passed. And I could imagine implementations that would actually, if during alerting you get back an update in the backwards direction that contains, new identity, it's not who you expect, or there's something broken about it, that would, cause you to not allow media to flow to the user. I imagine you would be able to set something like criticality, for example, in your user interface to say, for this call, it's actually important to me. I know I reached Bank of America. It might not be important for like everyday calls I make, but for this one, it actually does matter to me. I want it to fail if I'm not reaching the entity that I intended to reach. And we're not going to dictate a user experience in this draft, but I think it's worth at least articulating what some of the options are and what you could achieve with this assurance. And I've always been fascinated, since we first started thinking about this, by what you could do before the call even starts. Negotiating like a medialess session, for example, when you have your address book contact, or when, at that exact moment when you're clicking on the link in that SMS, that oh so trustworthy SMS you got that claims it's Bank of America, there's a number in there and you click on it. What happens then? What gets displayed to you before you then press the confirmed, I want to call that? That's an example of a place that a hook could exist to something that negotiates a medialess session, make sure you're seeing the right key from the other side, that no funny business is going on. So there's a bunch of things like that I think that we could at least provide hooks for that implementers could dig into. Next slide. Oh, or you want to talk, Chris?
I was just going to say that that is, to me, one of the more important cases, for sure, in terms of, like the right thing, I think, is from a user experience point of view, like that's most critical. And I think thinking about how we can make that work, maybe even without having to have complete, the question is, can that work across all use cases, or like existing call flows could support that somehow, so that you can more globally deploy this without having to have everyone supporting it. I think there might be some techniques to think about there, but yeah, I just wanted to give my +1 to that use case specifically.
Yeah, it's a cool use case. I think the best we're going to be able to do is create some hooks, like I said, and if we define the way the protocol can support this, people that are in a position to implement it will implement it. I don't know how much prac and update and things like that are practically used, in like the IPNNI, for example, Chris. Those are prerequisites for this, for example. And so, it may be a lift to get some people to do it, but I still think it's a capability that's worth specifying and making available, just because it's a feature. It'll go along with a lot of other places, like signing buys, for example, where I think we can see some pretty obvious value. Next slide.
So
Robert.
Before I move to the next slide, how many of big organizations like BOA, American Airlines, American Express, things like that, still leave calls in ringing while you're dealing with the IVR? Is that practice still ongoing?
Yeah, it's a fair cop. The user experience may be one where you're not gonna have a ton of alerting time for a variety of reasons. I saw you mention 183 in the Jabber. I think it really comes down to, if you have a criticality for a particular call and you're expecting to see that update in the backwards direction that is signed, has a passport in it, and if you don't see that, you want the user to stop. The harm of hearing a second of whatever early media or whatever gets played to you probably isn't that great. It's just, important that there be, for the cases where users do designate this as criticality, that, you have some opportunity to intervene.
Yeah, sure, but I don't think you're quite seeing the concern I've got. Going back to just the really, really dumb, simple call flow where you only have one thing that you're reaching, and all it does is send you a 183 and establish early media, and leaves you sitting there for maybe 20 or 30 minutes until you actually get to talk to an agent before it completes.
Yeah, I mean, is there not a crack update for that?
The last I looked at this, that doesn't happen.
Well, I'm aware that prac and update are not like used for this, but if you get a 183, you can prac it, right? Can you? You tell me. I haven't looked at this in ages, and honestly, it's 2 in the morning. So am I missing something obvious here?
No, I think there's a missing step before you could just you could start. I mean, down that path, you've got to have something to prac.
Oh, right.
So, but anyhow, it's just something to talk to consider in the set of attacks that you're trying to protect against. If the industry practice is still to leave the call in that alerting state, it's going to be hard to apply the protection.
Yeah. I don't know if I want to look this up in real time, but yeah, no, agreed. And I mean, so I guess partly I'd say too, maybe I would say go to the next slide, because I mean, we're really not here to solve the problem today, but just to say, okay, given that this is something that we think, is this something we think is interesting enough that we want to potentially adopt this and like start work on it here, because this is really the first time that I think we've had enough of a statement of what this is and how it's supposed to work, to articulate like, should the working group adopt this or not. I guess in terms of like what the lift is from previous 4916, it's actually pretty good for the most part. Like going through it, most of what it has to talk about is still pretty salient to 8224. It was originally written for the first version of Identity 4474. So like there's things like the identity info header that was in 4474. Obviously that is not in 8224. Things like that would just be removed. There were a couple of things as well, like, something when we were doing SIP Brandy that Adam Roach flagged then, about how kind of the resending mechanisms that we put into 8224 work for cases where like there's a failure of the structure perceived by the other side and so on. Like there are things like that that we would just have to reconcile with 4916, but I don't think it's a terribly heavy lift to get there. And of course, all the examples need to be redone, and everybody knows people just coded the examples, so it's kind of important we get that right. But the big idea of it is the same. We'd be using, we're not going to change the way that the from change requires thing works. And so, like I said, I just don't think it's that big a lift. So next slide. If there is a next slide, I think there is. Yeah, that's it. So I guess the question I'm really posing is, is this an idea whose time has come? Do we think that it's worth looking at this? And, if so, happy to do some more work towards it and kind of start looking at putting together new examples and, fixing some of the things that Adam was talking about. But, my real question is this something we think we should adopt? Is this an interesting area to work in? What do you mean by base passport, Ben? Not hearing you, Ben.
Yeah, you're still muted, Ben. I guess we'll wait till he comes back. So we don't have a whole lot of people here, but it would be useful to get a sense from the people who are here, who think that that it's time to address this problem, and that you have time to engage and help review and flesh out the document. So I think I will ask, there are few enough people here, just unmute or throw something into Jabber to say that you're willing to help contribute to this work.
Yeah, I don't think, Ben, that there is any issue with a passport extension being required.
Oh, Ben's on. Go ahead, Ben. Sorry. Oh, maybe not. Oh, yes.
I was just refreshing my audio in the bottom right-hand corner, and it flipped the state of my mute button. So I said everything in the chat I meant to.
This is Chris. I think you could imagine you maybe in the backwards direction would want to send RCD information, so there could be potential use of existing extensions, but I don't think there's an extension needed specific to this idea.
Yeah, it's certainly true.
So John, I think then if you could send a couple of messages to the list, drumming up some more support and fish for people that think that there's a problem with us pursuing this. Murray, when you have time, could you take a look at what we're doing and make sure that you're comfortable that we pursue this under our current charter? As John mentioned, it walks us a little bit out of the box that we originally laid out, but you know, it's up to you on whether or not you want to formally change the box. So,
yeah, I'll take a look. Probably next week.
Didn't we originally say that like CNIT wasn't in scope, right? So RCD wasn't in scope originally. So did we change the charter since then?
But you know, the question is as you're you know, boiling the water at some point, do you actually cross the you know, past the point where you've got anything to boil off? So,
yeah, fair enough. Fair enough. All right. Well, no, I appreciate that. Appreciate people saying that they're interested to review. I think we need it. Again, I think as we see more adoption in things like the mobile space where we have those, there's a whole class of these attacks, these like stretching attacks, short stopping attacks, all kinds of attacks that are just kind of based on the notion that people in the middle are, you know, messing with what would be mid dialogue requests. That I think it's probably something we're going to need to do eventually.
mm-hmm.
Okay. What's next? I've got so much energy left still. Stir for messaging. Okay, I can muster enough energy to do just this last one. All right, so yeah, stir for messaging. Next slide. Pretty exciting. New idea, new work, new draft, completely new, not something we're recycling from IETF 101. This is in fact an entirely new draft about leveraging Stir for text and multimedia instant messaging services. We think this is obviously most applicable to services that happen to use telephone numbers as their originating identifier. And you know, the reason why we think this is important these days is because message spam is becoming a much, much bigger problem all the time. And I'm sure that every step we take that makes voice spam harder will make message spam more attractive. There are certainly a class of entities today that are pretty good at doing like Bayesian analysis of the contents of these things to try to pick up spam patterns. But there's also this trend for encrypted messaging, which seems to just get more and more traction every day. I think I just saw something about like the entire Google system moving to their RCS system moving to encrypted messaging, things like that. So like we expect that you know, this problem will get harder to solve for messaging precisely because there's going to be so much encryption around it, and maybe the stir techniques can help. Certainly, if you were gonna do this for you know, text and just typical phone messaging, it would really be silly to stand up like a separate credential system from the credential systems that we're already building and deploying to secure telephone numbers for voice calls. And like that, just the, you know, that realization alone, I think is sufficient for us to at least take a look at, okay, is there something we want to say about what the interaction is, both with H226 and H224 with messaging. Of course, as with many phishing expeditions like this, you know, there's not a ton of like messaging providers on the call at the moment, and you know, this is not a slam dunk in terms of the overlap of some of the crucial entities who are performing those functions, the people who are getting stir certs today, who are at least responsible for the messaging applications for the telephone numbers in question. So our big question is who would actually use it? But you know, let's defer that for a minute and just kind of talk about how, you know, what's easy and what's hard to do with all this. So next slide. So there's stuff that we basically get for free. Like pretty much all session-based messaging, we pretty much get for free because it's just negotiated with SIP, right? As a session, these are things like MSRP or text over RTP. And as a consequence of that, you know, pretty much you should be able to stick an identity header and the invites that are setting those things up. And, you know, with a few little questions like, okay, like how does MKey interact with it? You know, maybe some things about how some of the particular extensions to Passport might interact with it. Those things should just kind of work, I'd like to think. And, you know, we kind of have a scope question around this. You know, we could literally restrict what we're talking about in this document to just messaging from phone numbers, though I'd note that, again, H224 really is broader than telephone numbers. It just happens that the 8226, the STIR certificates that we define, are pretty focused on telephone network identifiers, but it was never our intention that the identity mechanism would be restricted literally to use of telephone numbers. So, I mean, that's one thing we kind of have to negotiate out as we did this, but you know, at least the messaging from numbers part, I think it's pretty straightforward to see, you know, what we get for free from that. Next slide. And then there's like low-hanging fruit, like, you know, as I said, we're probably gonna have to start thinking about ways identity headers can be integrated into most types of SIP requests, you know, things like buys, things like updates. And there we have a message method. It's not used a tremendous amount, but again, in the low-hanging fruit category, it's pretty easy to imagine how you could apply Passport to something like the message method. And the basic way that we talk about doing this is by having a new claim you add to the Passport, the message I, which is just stolen shamelessly from the RCDI claim we created for RCD for a hash that provides integrity over the contents of RCD. Do the same thing for messaging. And if we did that, it'd probably be applicable to a lot of things other than the message method as well. Brian, you got a note?
Yeah. Over in emergency calling, we use message for one-shot requests for help. This is an alarm. Help, I've fallen, can't get up, or you know, any kind of alarm system where you don't have two-way interactive media, and we use message for that. And of course, we're busily engaged in trying to make sure that STIR is applicable to emergency calls because of swatting, where you spoof your phone number and then call the SWAT team on your neighbor. But being able to get resources dispatched fraudulently is a big deal. So we really want to be able to protect message.
Okay, good. Yeah, and I think this one's pretty straightforward, right? Just however the message is being encoded in the body, just have your integrity check over with message I. And like pretty much once you've created a passport that has, message I as a claim and a new passport type to go with it, you can kind of imagine like a lot of non-SIP cases where you might be able to glom a passport onto something. So next slide. Okay, if you've drunk all of the Kool-Aid so far, and you agree that it's probably worth at least articulating, okay, there's stuff we get for free, there's something that are pretty easy to do. Like, this is the hard version, the things that we would kind of add onto the scope and see if we could accomplish if we're going to do this. I mean, we could look at things like XMPP, right? We could look at all kinds of protocols that are, that carry messages and try to figure out how to integrate passports with them. I suspect that probably it'll be of more value for us to create a framework that it's just easy for non-SIP systems to leverage than it would be to really kind of try to go through every protocol and say, like, here's how Passport would work with that. There's going to turn out to be a lot of proprietary ecosystems that just have their own security and are doing it fine. Like, I'm not sure how much value iMessage is going to get from this. I don't really follow MLS much here. I mean, maybe like Russ or somebody like follows it more than me. But like, MLS integration is another thing we could potentially look at, because it is in fact a framework, as far as I understand, that a lot of different messaging systems are going to use as their underpinning, and we might be able to help provide like an authentication service to MLS. Chris, did you have a note?
Yeah, sort of related to MLS. I was watching the S-Frame stuff, and they were talking about associating participants with each media stream, and that sort of cries out for a framework. I think going to the media stream is pretty going a step too far. So like, at the signaling layer, whatever that turns out to be for an application that uses S-Frame, it should probably incorporate this framework. So just another example.
Sure. No, it's a good one.
MLS seems to be focusing more on encrypting group chat.
Oh, fair enough. Yeah. Again, it's really more just kind of where this is the question of where things would take work, right? So we're kind of looking for, are there any places that we could try to plug into in the IETF that we'd want to plug into, that we think would be salient to this. Not necessarily shopping for much there, but I mean, I think having just a generic description, imagine we do like the message I thing we just described, having some kind of a framework that says, okay, if you wanted to apply, passports with message I to your proprietary or, open messaging system, here are some guidelines, here are the kind of credentials you'd use, here's, et cetera, et cetera. And so, I mean, we could do something like that, and then it's just kind of up to the community if people think it's worth integrating that in with anything. I think we might actually get some takers, just because so many carriers, enterprises, and systems out there are just going to have the STIR credentials anyway. Providing a story for how those STIR credentials could be used to help secure messaging it just seems like the kind of thing that would probably get some uptake. That's my pitch. Next slide. I mean, I think the real question I have for people is, do we want to work in this space, right? And secondarily, showing my stuff we get for free, stuff that's low-hanging fruit, stuff that's hard. Where do people want to set the scope? If so,
I need this, so I want it, and I'll work on it.
Oh, I'll wait for Ben. Go ahead, Ben.
So intellectually, I really like this. I mean, I have a soft spot for MSRP and message, and would love to see anything to add security to them. The reservation I have for messaging systems in general, I posted in the chat earlier. We saw the Google announcement about doing end-to-end encryption in RCS, and if you dig down into the technical paper, it seems to say they're using the Signal protocol. which
Yeah.
to me kind of moves more in the MLS direction in the long run. And I also, hope someday to see things like RCS and iMessage integrate, and wonder if they would use something like this, or if they would go more down the MLS line, and maybe just in point-to-point, two-person, one, not group messaging, whatever you call the opposite of group messaging. MLS might be too heavyweight for, I don't know. But that's my concern about whether it will get used in the general case, although I think Brian's use case is a good enough reason all by itself.
This is Chris. I think, certainly as it relates to telephone number associated things, and sort of the industry connections we have with StarShaken, I think, and those certificates, it'd be nice to sort of have a common framework. So I think that's part of the reason for doing this. One other thought I'd bring up, which goes back to the last draft we talked about with connected identity, is you obviously don't want to send RCD information in every message. That would be a lot of overhead. So should there be more of a framework of getting the person you're chatting with their information via some connected identity mechanism at the beginning, or as part of your address book, or all those use cases, and then that sort of ties in with the same credentials for the messages that are being sent, and again, a broader framework here for identity in general.
Yeah, I mean that could be. It could be. So anybody think this sucks? We shouldn't do it.
I think we can do the SIP related message stuff without a recharter. The way I read, while you were talking, I looked at the charter, and the other ones that go beyond that may require some kind of a recharter, but I'm certainly interested in seeing this go forward. Go ahead, Brian.
I need this bad enough that I don't want to get bogged down in general frameworks getting beyond message, MSRP, things you do with SIP. So I'm a little concerned that it'll take 2 or 3 years because we're doing all this generic use it outside of SIP, and my simple use case will be waiting for all of that. So I have that reservation, but I'll try to work on it anyways.
Well, I think the only thing we really need to work out on message I, and this is in the document a bit, is how to deal with the plurality of message types, like versus things carried in SMPP versus like MMS messaging, right? And do we need some typing of messages in order to give different profiles for how the hash is generated? And I know even like SMPP, there's different versions of it, right? And there's a bunch of there's a bunch of cruft is, I guess, the issue around how these messages are structured. And so, I think that's the only thing we actually need to resolve for that to be stable. And, the general framework thing, yeah, it's going to end up being some non-normative, descriptive text, right? Almost necessarily. So, it might linger as an internet draft as things do, but everybody implements internet drafts anyway, so it's,
Yeah, I don't know exactly where you're thinking, but it does seem to me that there's quite a lot you have to do. You don't have an identity header in those environments, so you need to reference something that does what identity does, but not in SIP. There's all kinds of things that you'd have to do in order to use it outside of SIP.
Well, and there's some text in the document already about out of bound, and that text already says, the most obvious thing you could say about the interaction of messaging and OOB, which is if you have an internet stream that lets you deliver passports, and you can't deliver instant messages over it. Like, this isn't a voice call. Like, what aberrant condition exists such that like can't integrate the passport in with whatever message you're sending along. And so, I mean, yeah, I don't know how big or small that problem is, to be honest. I mean, I think there's probably a lot of just institutional practices and business models and things like that that'll be more of the limitations than technical limitations are.
Yeah, I was going to say this is Chris. We sort of do have that abstraction layer with the way we did passport and 8225 and 8224, where we have both the generic passport that anybody can integrate in any signaling. And then, 8224 is the specific way of doing it. So I sort of think we have the bones for that anyways, but I get your point. Sorry, Brian.
Yeah, we can try. So what we're hearing from Brian's, which is good feedback, is like, don't go crazy with the scope. Like, let's get something done that we can actually get done that's important to get done. It's probably good advice.
So Brian, your need for this. If we did magic and there was something well defined today, what does the deployment pipeline look like? Is it something that you would start immediately taking advantage of?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, we plan to just do it anyways, right? Because message can have an identity header, and it doesn't need to be invite, and so we just assumed we could just do it for message. We have in the North American Emergency Number NINA specs explicit text now about verification for incoming emergency calls, and we assumed that we could apply it to message exactly the same. There are equivalents outgoing, right? So think of an incoming text that again might be NSRP. So that was something we haven't really thought through, but we do use MSRP for instant messaging, but we set that up with SIP. So again, we assumed that we could just use the invite, use the identity coming in with that invite to protect against. We have the problem outgoing, right? We need to you do a call back from an emergency call if the caller hangs up prematurely or you need to get more information. And that, again, there's infrastructure being set up now and discussions with ATIS and everything to get certs for the 911 authorities to be able to sign outgoing calls from emergency services to, because they look like carriers, but they aren't carriers, and for various reasons you don't do it the way you used to do it. So I think all of this is real simple. I think it's just just covering all the bases, making sure that we have standards coverage for the obvious things and all the right statements are made that make sure that we're okay. But for SIP-based stuff, I think this is pretty easy.
Yeah, I think it's pretty easy. I agree. I mean, I wonder, does NINA at all think about, are you able to assess how significant, message I is to this? Because I agree, you can just like stick a vanilla passport in a message method.
Well, so the emergency services have the problem that they can't realistically implement 25 different messaging inputs. So we go back to, look, just interwork the MSRP and everything will be fine. Because we can't handle a lot of proprietary messaging. Now there's statements in the draft and the standards that say that may not work. We may have to implement, another few instant messaging protocols in order to get enough coverage. So that, iMessage is the obvious thing to do. But RCS uses MSRP, so we're kind of hopeful we can just slide that through. But there are the cases of individual message in RCS. It's permitted, and so having a one shot has to work.
Yeah, it doesn't really narrowly, like if having a signed hash over the message itself is valuable. I mean, again, in emergency services context, do you care if like the message has been tampered with?
We don't currently have a concern there. I think anything that improves integrity of any part of a communication with emergency services is worthwhile. People have expressed the issue of, all right, you get this real nice signaling authentication and then someone crashes the media stream. We want to use SRTP, blah, 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 but, deployment of that's pretty limited. So, if it offered the ability to do better integrity of messaging and things like that, we would say, oh, yes, we'll do that. I mean, we'll implement that in a flash, but not the primary concern. The primary concern is swatting, right?
Right. Okay.
This is Chris. I don't know if this is taking it a step too far, but I would assume integrity has to do with images and videos that you might send over text. And is there any, if I'm sending a picture of a crime scene, should there be integrity of that from a legal perspective and a liability perspective, or there could be things that could be associated with that.
Yeah, I mean that's all very, very, very desirable. Don't call that primary. The primary part is making sure we know who you are.
Well, I mean, so yeah, the concern in the absence of integrity is, cut and paste attacks where somebody, outbound message from emergency services, somebody can grab that, cut and paste their own message in and send it to somebody. Yeah.
Same issue. It's the identity that's the primary problem. Don't claim you're from 911. Don't be able to claim that you're from 911. But all of those things are useful, and I'd like to have it, but it's a like to have. The gotta have is an identity protection for all these one-shot messages, MSRP, things like that.
All right, sounds good. So next steps, we should.
Quick question, Brian. Do you care about replay?
Well, certainly message replay, yes. Yes, we do.
Okay, I mean, I don't see this mechanism giving you that.
Right.
Okay.
So, ton of interest here is what I've heard. I think that we can just issue a call for adoption on the list on this one, just to see if anybody stands up and yells, "Hey, what are you doing?" and move forward.
Sounds good. Yeah, no, I'm psyched about this. I think some people might get jazzed about it.
Chris, you had something you wanted to talk about if we had time, and I think we've got a few minutes left.
Sure. Yeah, I submitted a draft. An individual draft. I put a note out onto the list. It's called STIR Identity Header Error Handling. It covers two main topics, at least for now. unless there's others that want to contribute to it. The first one is a technique that we defined in IPNNI, but I recalled that it's not supported in 8224, which is the ability to send provisional error responses to signal errors back to the authentication service without terminating the call. So, an alternative to sending the 4XX errors. The second thing is related to, we didn't cover, there's actually a note in 8224 that talks about this issue, but doesn't propose a solution. So this is proposing a solution to when you have multiple identity headers and you have some that succeed and some that fail, what do you do in that situation, which is becoming more relevant. So basically, the proposal in the document is that you actually send back in the body the passports that are associated with the individual errors. We talked about, like, is there something simpler to do there? We didn't really include any unique identifiers for each identity header, which is maybe unfortunate, but the passport itself can be the unique identifier. That's the proposal. Obviously be great if people can take a look and suggest things, open to comments, obviously. So maybe try to beef up the document, and if there's any list discussion, that would be much appreciated. And that's it.
I agree that this is probably the best way to handle this. I mean, I'd rather do this than hack like UIDs or something into passports that, you correlate and play with to figure out which ones are broken. And if you do, I mean, depending on which entities add passports as the message, goes by, it won't be useful to everybody to even see what those UIDs are. And the only reservation I have about this approach, and it's so minor, I don't really think it's we need to do a lot of work on it, is the div part. Is if we end up revealing service logic responsible for forwarding decisions in the backwards direction, and
Yeah.
Connect ID has the same problem, by the way, so it's not unique to this, but that's something I can imagine somebody hollering about. But I mean, if div is the failure, I imagine that divs could be consumed by the entities that are performing the diversions. And so just as long as there's a way to extract passports from the body on the way back as you wind the stack back, I think it should be okay.
Yeah, div might be an exception. I mean, I think we already have caveats on, where people should verify those things, and, so I do think there is thought that needs to be put. I mean, the more critical use case here, for me at least, is the shaken identity header succeeds and RCD fails, or vice versa. And, those are the more critical things to identify and notify the authentication service that maybe there's an issue going on, that the signature failed or whatever.
In a lot of these cases, depending on how we treat some of these RCD passports, it's a non-critical error. It's curious whether people report that, and what you do if it was reported, things like it. But I agree, it's definitely worth having the capability to report them.
So just a question, and I will preface it with the traditional. I haven't read the draft, but I wonder, does out of band come into play here? Would you ever need to do this sort of thing for out of band?
I'll defer to John, but I certainly haven't thought about. I mean, out of band, there's parts that I don't know if you can connect the chain all the way back without a band, but I'll defer to you, John.
Yeah, I mean, so this is a patch to 8224 and specifically to SIP's request handling and error response mechanisms and to the SIP response code. So I think it is actually specific to 8224. To the broader question of should there be a way to do this if you're doing out of band, I mean, that'd be great. You know, I'm certainly open to ideas, but if we can just patch 8224, I'd be happy.
Right.
Asked when you mentioned not wanting to put a UID in the passports themselves, it occurred to me that I wonder if that would be useful for out of band. But I'm completely speculating. I haven't thought about this at all.
Yeah, I really don't want to put UIDs in passports at this point. I mean, we're pretty far down the road on all of this, and like that would be a big lift just for the implementation community at this point.
Well, and again, the passport itself is sort of a UID, right? So it could, you know, you could think of things that way. And I think they already are sort of thought about it that way in OOB, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah. And I mean, you know, hey, and Shaken, those orig IDs, doesn't the RFC for that say they're supposed to be globally unique and generate? So effectively, not that anybody does that in the IPNNI, but if everybody did that, then we'd have a globally unique identifier already in passports.
Yeah, they're specific to Shaken, but that could be. I don't know. I think I actually don't think using the passport is a bad idea, but certainly open to other opinions on that one.
The same conclusion as Chris independently on this, that this was the best way to do it. So I mean, right. I think it's the least worst way to patch what's wrong with 8224.
Right. Cool. All right, thanks.
All right. Well, I think that we have exhausted our agenda and our any other business. Thank you, everyone, for staying up to the end of a very long meeting. I hope that we'll see each other in person before too long, but until then, we'll see you on the list. And
stay safe, everybody.